Tisha B'Av, or the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, is a day of fasting that is considered the most tragic and mournful day on the Hebrew calendar, falling usually in July or August on the Gregorian calendar. An almost unbelievable string of disastrous events throughout Jewish history have taken place on this day. According to Jewish tradition, 10 of the 12 spies, all except for Joshua and Caleb, brought back a bad report about the land of Israel on this day. The Romans crushed the Bar Kokhba revolt on this day in AD 135. The First Crusade commenced around this time in 1096, which led to more than 10,000 Jewish deaths. On or around Tisha B'Av, the Jewish people were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and from Spain in 1492. In 1914, Germany entered World War I on Tisha B'Av, which would ultimately reshape that nation and create an environment in which the anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust would thrive. On Tisha B'Av in 1941, the Nazis approved and began to implement the final solution, marking the beginning of the Holocaust. In 1942, just 1 year later, the mass deportation of Jewish people from the Warsaw Ghetto to the death camp at Treblinka began, also on Tisha B'Av. Each of these events led to unspeakable Jewish suffering and death. There are other examples of the devastation that we can mention. However, in the Jewish heart and mind, the most significant and horrific atrocities to take place on Tisha B'Av were the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC and the Second Temple by the Romans in AD 70. The Lord intended the temple to be the meeting place between God and man. God chose to place His name in Jerusalem and set the temple in this city as a diadem is set in a crown, the one place on earth where His presence would dwell among His people. It was the center of Jewish existence, where individual and communal sacrifice, praise, worship, and celebration would all take place. According to the scripture, both temples were ultimately destroyed because of Israel's national sins. Historically, when we see the Jewish people without the temple, we see a people in exile, scattered, with an intense longing to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. Because of these things, primarily for the religious Jewish communities, Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning and fasting. For 25 hours, there is no eating or drinking, no washing or bathing, and no marital relations. There are intense prayers recited while taking a posture of humility, sitting or lying on the floor. There is crying out to God, asking Him, "Where are you?" While reading through the book of Lamentations, the emotion-filled, heart-wrenching lament attributed to the weeping prophet Jeremiah, who watched as Jerusalem was ransacked and leveled by the invading Babylonians. While the heaviness of this day can be overbearing, it is important to remember that with God, there is hope that one day God Himself will reverse the effects of Israel's national sins and regather His people to the land of Israel. This messianic hope looks ahead to a day when God will restore Jerusalem, rebuild the temple of praise, and take up His place as king, ruling and reigning from His throne in Jerusalem. Amid man's destruction, there exists a hope built on Messiah. We can even say that Tisha B'Av, a story of destruction, persecution, and suffering, an account of the awful effects of sin, and a story that ends with God's promise for a glorious future. It is the story of Messiah, and it is one that is found in biblical prophecy. Lamentations 2:9, which is read on Tisha B'Av, describes the severity of the invasion of Jerusalem. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has destroyed and broken her bars. Her king and her princes are among the nations. The Torah is no more. Also her prophets find no vision from the Lord. It describes a situation that is very bleak. Her gates have sunk into the ground. It's a very telling description of how the invaders destroyed and buried the gates and walls surrounding the city and the Temple of Solomon. The city was leveled, hope was cut off, but from the midst of the rubble, God speaks hope. Psalm 24:7 describes the prophetic reversal of Lamentations 2:9. It is one of the most glorious descriptions of the coming of the Messiah, the King of Israel. It states this: "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. The city that was once left desolate will be gloriously lifted up, reestablished, and fully restored. And such a rebirth will only come with the return of the King Messiah himself, Yeshua of Nazareth. He is coming, the glorious King, who has put on human flesh and been tempted as we are, who has met us in our sin and desolation, and has joined us and tasted the effects of sin by enduring death. He has risen from the rubble and lifted the gates so that we may enter with him and experience a kind of access to God that has been lost for so long. He is our hope in times of mourning. He is the hope of Tisha B'Av."